I'm sure you've heard about trad wives, short for traditional wives, who embrace the traditional gender roles like cooking all their food from scratch,
let's make some lasagna from scratch,
homemaking, and supporting their husbands as the head of the household. Their content is causing quite a stir. Check out some of the comments on just one Instagram post from Mormon trad wife Hannah Nealman of Ballerina Farm. On one side, we have a commenter saying, "You left your dreams, ambitions, and career for the sake of your husband's dream. The trad wife life is abhorrent." On the other side of the debate, we have a commenter who says, "Feminists hate wholesome content, they hate nuclear families, they hate motherhood, and they hate to see women who are actually happy." And this last comment is really interesting to me. "Eres una verdadera mujer." You are a true woman. So what comes up for you when you hear these comments? When I hear them, my chest gets tight and I feel like I can't breathe. At least I used to feel like that. I can now read this stuff and I don't even get rattled. You know why? Because I learned the historical context. This conflict is not new, and the generations of women before us have already unlocked the wisdom that we need right now to make sense of it. In this series, we've already seen women's empowerment moving forward and backward. In our last video, we covered the Victorian cult of domesticity, also called the cult of true womanhood. Remember that comment, "You are a true woman"? Let's call this Trad Wives Part 1. But then women made a huge step forward in their successful fight for the vote. Then we had Virginia Woolf's social commentary and women working in the Second World War and Eleanor Roosevelt urging women to keep moving forward. But then we ended up with men coming back home from the war and taking their jobs back. The government encouraged men to get back to work and start building the economy, and they encouraged women to get back home and start a baby boom. This brings us to a new cult of domesticity. Let's call this Trad Wives Part 2. The motto of the post-war era was, "Happy days are here again," and magazine images from the time are chock full of beautiful, slender, white women in their gleaming homes, taking care of their perfectly groomed children while their husbands are busy running the world. And because it had historical momentum and religious authority on its side, this ideology was widely accepted and unquestioned. But two women, one in France and one in the United States, disrupted the culture in a way that had never been done before. First, Simone de Beauvoir. Beauvoir was a philosopher and college professor, and she was also the long-term partner of famed French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. In the late 1940s, Beauvoir started a massive research project, a complete and thorough investigation of the system of patriarchy from the dawn of time until her own lifetime. What a great idea. She published this research in the form of a book called The Second Sex, which came out in French in 1949 and was translated into English in 1953. It is hard to sufficiently convey the importance of this book. We've talked about earlier women who had written about gender inequities and made really brilliant critiques of patriarchy. But this book became known as the Feminist Bible, and it set in motion a movement that literally changed the world. Here's the TLDR in 4 quick points. Number 1, Beauvoir's main point can be summed up in the title, The Second Sex. We live in a world where men are considered the one, the self, the subject. Women exist in relation to men as the other, the object, the sidekick. Men act, women are acted upon. Men rule, women are ruled. Men are the first sex, women are the second sex. How do we still see that in our real lives? Have you ever sat at a dinner table where the man sat at the head of the table with his wife at his side? Have you ever ridden in a car where the man automatically took the driver's seat and the woman only drove if a man wasn't present? Point number 2. Beauvoir looks at science and history and myth and art, trying to figure out where this notion of male primacy and female inferiority comes from. And she concludes that women are not born inferior. In fact, they're not even born what we think of as feminine. Instead, they are shaped by a billion external influences that condition them into accepting and then performing what their culture has decided are feminine traits, which vary from culture to culture. One of Beauvoir's most famous quotes is that one is not born, but becomes woman. And this hugely influenced the way people came to see sex as distinct from gender, sex being a set of physical characteristics and gender being a set of cultural norms that we learn from our environment. Number 3, one of those cultural norms that Western society made up is keeping women in the role of homemaker. Here, Beauvoir does a takedown of the cult of domesticity, and she describes how men assign themselves the work outside the home.
So long, honey.
Learning, doing, creating, building on the advancements made by men in the past, and rising above the basic work of staying alive in order to accomplish works of creativity and genius. She calls this transcendence. Meanwhile, the necessary work keeping these transcendent geniuses fed and clothed, as well as producing the next generation of male builders and creators, happens at home, behind the scenes, by women. Women work from sunup to sundown, making food, making clothes, cleaning, taking care of kids, and making the home a safe, happy place for men and children to come home to. It's a hamster wheel, and it doesn't allow women any time to transcend survival mode. Beauvoir calls this immanence. Have you seen this in your life? I sure have. Just last week, a woman with an empty nest told me that her husband is super excited about all of the challenging creative projects he's doing at work. Meanwhile, she said to me, I stay busy all day, but at the end of the week, I have nothing to show for it. I don't even know what I did with my time, and I don't really know what the purpose of my life is. That's transcendence and immanence. Number 4, throughout the book, Beauvoir talks about ways that women are complicit in their otherness. She says that women often go along with their oppression, but this is because they're trained to be meek and self-sacrificial, and they're praised and rewarded when they exhibit those qualities. So it's really hard for women to give up the security and comfort of societal approval for some vague notion of equality. Have you seen this in real life? I have. A lot of people say that feminism is all about women being able to do whatever they want to do. In response, I might say that if a woman is indoctrinated to live a life of being in the supporting role and subjugating herself, if she believes that that's the only choice that God and her family and the community will approve of, is it really a choice? I highly recommend reading The Second Sex. I personally disagreed with part of it, and Beauvoir was a very problematic person in many ways. Look her up if you're curious. But she made the invisible forces of patriarchy visible and gave people tools to dismantle some of the oppressive systems that no one had been able to see clearly before. So Beauvoir was the disruptor in France, and I told you before that there was also a disruptor in the United States, whose book landed a 1-2 punch along with The Second Sex. Who was she, and what did she do? Her name was Betty Friedan. Born Betty Naomi Goldstein, Friedan was Jewish, and she said that she developed a passion against injustice that originated from her feelings of the injustice of anti-Semitism. She attended Smith College, a historically women's college, from 1838 to 1942. That's where my daughter's attending college right now. In 1957, Friedan and her classmates attended their 15-year reunion. These women had since married and were busy raising their children behind their white picket fences. At the reunion, there was lots of catching up, and Friedan reported asking her friends, "How are you doing?" No, how are you really doing? And these women said, "I'm not doing great. I burst into tears for no reason. Sometimes I just lose it and start yelling at my kids. I love my kids and I love my husband. I don't know what's wrong with me." So many women answered this way that Friedan knew she had hit a nerve. She collected her friends' statements, and then she dove into research, trying to figure out what was happening. She called the condition that these women were describing the problem that has no name, and she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. Here's the TLDR of The Feminine Mystique in 3 main points. The term the feminine mystique refers to a vibe of perfection that was actively being marketed to women. As we talked about earlier, America was deep in round 2 of the cult of domesticity, and the ideal American woman was white, thin, Christian, and very demure, very mindful of her role as her husband's supporter. Unlike past generations, these women may have gone to college because, like lipstick, a little education, but not too much, was very attractive to men at the time. Does this sound familiar? Do you see the feminine mystique perfectionism at play in the trad wife content we talked about earlier? Point 2. Friedan writes that corporations in the 1950s were actively, purposely feeding women the ideology of the feminine mystique to keep them buying products. Just think of this in historical context. A ton of home appliances had recently been invented that were supposed to free up time for women. Instead of scrubbing laundry on a washboard, you could throw it in a washing machine. Instead of baking a cake from scratch, you could just add water to a boxed mix. But weirdly, instead of spending less time on housework, women were spending more time, and they were spending money. Housewives' spending comprised a huge percentage of the American economy, so companies were very motivated to keep women in the home buying products.
Well, I'm too stunned to argue.
Friedan interviewed all male CEOs of all kinds of companies who admitted that they were blatantly creating ads that sold women standards of housekeeping perfection and then exploited women's insecurities that they weren't measuring up. Do we see this today? Is it possible that corporations and even content creators might be exploiting women's insecurities in order to make money off of us? If so, stop watching that content. It is an old trick. Don't fall for it. Third, Friedan reported that women were depressed and anxious and bored because they weren't using their talents and potential. One part of the book that I will remember forever is when she interviews Abraham Maslow, of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and he says, capacities are needs, and they clamor to be used. And basically, if you don't use them, you get depressed, maybe even physically sick. I cried when I read that, and I remembered myself being so depressed as a young housewife that I felt like I was turning into a ghost. I so wish that I had known about this book during that time of my life. I wish my mom and my mother-in-law would have read it. It would have helped them so much. Anyway, a ton of women did read it. And for these women, it was like Neo taking the red pill and waking up to see the Matrix. Between Beauvoir and Friedan, people finally started to see that they weren't crazy and they weren't alone. And the problem they were experiencing did have a name. It was patriarchy, and they could do something about it. So, to those of you who feel triggered by tradwife content, I hope this helped. My advice is to be kind to other women. We've all been harmed by patriarchy, and we're all just trying to figure it out. But also, we've been here before. There's no need to still be defining women as the second sex and confining them to lives where they're not fulfilling their beautiful, powerful human potential. Because now we know better. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and please send this video on to someone who needs it.